I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our next speaker, the former Prime Minister of the Bahamas, the Right Honorable Perry Gladstone Christie. He was a smart enough lawyer to actually marry one of us, being an accountant. His lovely wife, although I would say that he has to be very careful because with her skill set as a lawyer and accountant, she will now be in a position to ensure that he goes missing physically, legally, and also financially. So he has every reason to behave himself. He will be disappointed in terms of actually missing out on all of the fetes that we would have normally in this Caribbean conference because he considers himself, I think, one of those Bojangles. He has been in public life for 40 years, which actually debunks his myth that he is still a millennial, although he acts as young as he ever was. With that, he is one of those leaders who is well known amongst us in the Caribbean and well suited to bring his insights and experiences to bear in terms of we look forward and think about what we need to be whilst we manage reality. With that, we turn it over to the Right Honorable Perry Gladstone Christie. Welcome, Mr. Christie.
Thank you for inviting me to share some views on our region as we move into the future. For the purposes of information, I have spent more than 40 years in public life. But I will always remember when as Prime Minister speaking in Jamaica, I was asked what led Jamaica to being rated higher than the Bahamas in the category of ease of doing business. It was a shocking realization to me, and I needed no further convincing of the need for a national development plan for the Bahamas. It became a critical priority in the governance of an island nation with a population spread over 100,000 square miles of ocean. The intention of the national plan is to ensure that all information necessary for making the best decisions are readily available to the decision makers. The extent to which we are competitive, need to improve our competitiveness, will all be embraced in the strategies arising from the national plan. I believe that our experience in the chain of islands in the Bahamas can truly serve as a template for our region. But given the enormity and savagery of the impact of the pandemic, given the enormity of the impact of the pandemic, a category
David, you may need to mute and vmix.
Of the impact of the pandemic, of the impact of a Category 5 hurricane in the Bahamas. Volcanic go.
We can hear you, Mr. Prime Minister.
Sorry for the interruption, but the question was whether or not I'm being heard. And I was speaking.
You are being heard.
Of the savage impacts of any number of natural disasters and the pandemic, bringing about a need, really a compelling urgency to ensure that our region has a plan that is designed not only for effective governance, but also to ensure that whatever expertise is required to come up with a plan that will anticipate these kinds of emergencies or towards ensuring the best security for our nations and our people. Decisions that are made are required us to move forward subject to the political realities of states. One of the great challenges in the region is that we have 15 realities, 15 states where there is no automatic one voice position in CARICOM. Health issues, therefore, like the pandemic and natural disasters are now on record with enormous debt consequences on the national budgets of our countries, and obliges us as a region in our planning to determine whether the extent to which a commitment to financing, whether humanitarian or emergency support, can be negotiated as an assurance in support of anticipation of any such disaster occurring. We know, for example, that hurricanes will take place. We know that there are other types of disasters. We see the volcanic activity in St. Vincent. And the question is, do we continue to wait for them to happen? Or do we use our collective will to move forward in negotiating with developed countries for a commitment to support us in the event of such disasters taking place? We have an immediate twin considerations where we need to review CARICOM's agencies. One of the recommendations that I'd like to make is that we ought to review the agencies of CARICOM to determine their sufficiencies in dealing with a post-pandemic world. We also should immediately review our traditional sources of funding for national budgets, involving determining what funding is available in our region. One of the striking examples that we have in this pandemic, that if someone arrives from outside the jurisdiction to one of our countries like the Bahamas or Jamaica or Trinidad, they would expect to come in where there's a protocol agreed to. But in this pandemic, we were left to our own resources, each country having to determine its own strategy, and therefore not being able to maximize the advantages we have of bringing all of our scientists together and ourselves finding the right formula for our respective region and the countries in it. So in this pandemic economy, you simply cannot approach ideal fiscal responsibility unless you grow the economy. And one of the fundamentals of our economy in the Bahamas is that we know once the pandemic is solved or being solved, that our job is to grow the economy, to increase revenue with a view to looking for new levels of investment and those investments leading to job creation. So in this regard, the CARICOM regional plan that I've spoken of to assist in national development sectors, it will have at your fingertips where you are, country or region. Most importantly, it will tell us whether or not we're meeting our expectations. And there's no need to search for data. It confronts you and, in fact, readily available to you. One of the challenges that we have is that there are some countries that have been more successful than others with the management of the pandemic. The CARICOM consensus is that at this time, we are not in a post-pandemic moment. We still have many countries that still have a great deal of work to do and a need to accelerate the pace of vaccinations and persuading reluctant citizens to be vaccinated. Regardless of the heavy burden of debt, healthcare, and education, which are fundamental rights of our citizens, we must prioritize the continuing to press forward. This is an overarching need requiring, obviously, looking at the debt challenges, and we in our country must do better at that. It is important for us to note that the Bahamas in looking at healthcare, in being able to determine that everyone should have access to it, made a decision to hire two accounting firms at different stages, one KPMG and the other PricewaterhouseCoopers. They provided services in furtherance of the objective of our being able to determine the feasibility of implementing national health insurance with a first phase of primary care, giving everyone access to medical treatment. We've had beautiful assistance, is one way to describe it. And so much so that KPMG, in response to negative comments about national health insurance being a drag on the economy, they argued persuasively that their experience in the Republic of South Africa indicated that national health insurance would be a benefit to the economy of the Bahamas. Regardless to that, CARICOM has a responsibility of assisting countries in determining whether through PAHO, the World Health Organization, of how to rationalize our resources dedicated to healthcare with a view to ensuring that we have maximum assistance to the least of our people, to the most disadvantaged of them. Now, I have decided to address some time to addressing tourism and financial services. Tourism, I have described all over the Caribbean that we have a beautiful country, a country where the flora, the fauna, the people, the culture lends itself to a wonderful tourism industry. Our country has suffered greatly through this pandemic, where the industry has virtually been brought to a halt. And even though we look forward to the beginning, where heritage tourism, sports tourism, cultural tourism, growing our air arrivals, growing our cruise ship arrivals, all of these things can take place. The Bahamas has been embracing, for example, in discussions with cruise ships, home porting. We have also been negotiating with cruise ships certain destinations within our islands where they're able to make significant investments and have their cruise ships make calls there. But the Caribbean is recognized as the world's most tourism-dependent region. And it is high time that the Caribbean becomes one of the world's most tourism-competent regions. And it is indeed your skill set that the Caribbean must draw on to attain the competence that is needed to maximize the extraction of value from tourism. There is no question that the people in our region are recognized as some of the most literate and articulate in the world. But in order to get to where we need to be in tourism, we must now become some of the most numerate, because there is also no question that this brave new world is being driven by digitization, data, and analytics. It is no more or no longer sufficient for the minister or director of tourism to make seat-of-the-pants decisions when data are available or can be made available to validate the expenditure of precious resources. There has always been copious streams of data flowing from tourism: number of visitors, average length of stay, average room rate, average daily expenditure, levels of visitor satisfaction on a number of experiences, and on and on and on. But today it is no longer good enough to know how many visitors come from the United States. We need to know how many visitors came from each zip code in the United States, and those zip codes with the highest level of visitor spending, along with the highest level of visitor satisfaction, and seek to find zip codes of a similar composition and direct our marketing and communication efforts to those. We in the Caribbean are all familiar with the phrase, fish where the fish are, and the fabulous analytical tools available today enable marketers to identify and target their best drops. These data and analytical tools are also magical in identifying trends that could not be easily seen otherwise. They provide for us actionable insights that point us in the right direction with regard to increasing business and also increasing levels of visitor satisfaction. With regard to the latter, a major error that many countries in our region make is to focus almost entirely on collecting data on visitors, while paying little attention to the collection of data on the attitudes of our own citizens towards tourism. We all know that tourism is the only business in the world that involves every resident. But at our own peril, we pay scant attention to ensuring that every resident understands and can assist in ensuring the best experience for all our visitors. That is a most important piece of analysis that we must conduct constantly. Finally, there is the opportunity to personalize the experience for our visitors by capturing data on their interests and preferences. There is some solid research that shows that prospective visitors spend up to 13 cumulative hours planning what to do on a 4-day trip. Imagine how we can provide our visitors with a personalized itinerary if we knew the kind of experiences that they would wish to enjoy during their time in our country. The time has long passed for us to hope that our visitors enjoy their stay in our countries. Data, science can now begin to ensure that they have the most wonderful experiences. It is for me to tell you that tourism still and is likely to be the primary economic sector of the Caribbean for a very long time to come. That is not because we have no desire to diversify, because we do. That is simply because there is no region in the world with such a wealth of wonderful travel experiences like the Caribbean. It is in this area of tourism that we have a natural, competitive, and comparative advantage compared to any other region in the world. And what tourism now needs is you. Every year, annual occupancies in the Caribbean are on the order of 60 to 65%. If we manage to use these new analytical tools in the ways described and manage to move those occupancies to 90%, we will have increased the contribution of tourism to the national GDP by 50% without building one more room. Just imagine that. We still need those literate and articulate Caribbean minds to deliver the messages in our own Caribbean way. But the Caribbean needs your numerate and analytical minds to determine which messages to deliver. I want to turn to financial services. The financial services sector across the Caribbean was being attacked by OECD countries prior to the global pandemic, with those countries mischievously using the perception of the Caribbean region being known for piracy to suggest that the Caribbean in turn is more susceptible to being used for money laundering and terrorist financing. But the real objective was to eliminate any competitive advantage that so-called offshore centers had as a result of systems of taxation that were not identical to OECD countries. The global pandemic will only strengthen the resolve of these large countries to eliminate offshore centers as protectionism becomes the order of the day, whether admitted or not. With the United States now aggressively pursuing global tax rules, the EU and OECD now have backup. The financial services sector across the Caribbean have been responsible for a large portion of the middle class in the region. However, countries in the region have attempted to negotiate bilaterally with the big boys. Ironically, the big boys have collaborated themselves and negotiated as a bloc. Yet the countries in the Caribbean attempt to go it alone. As the sector has suffered the proverbial 1,000 cuts, so has the middle class. But wealthy individuals are only getting wealthier, and the demand for financial services remains strong. It has simply evolved. And so must the financial services sector of the Caribbean. While tax policies vary across the region, we all must ask whether our tax systems, one, provide sufficient revenue to fund the demands on the public purse, because based on debt to GDP ratios across the Caribbean, the answer is obvious. Provide for the principles of equity, that is, based on ability to pay. Based on the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots again, this answer appears obvious. To enable global competitiveness, based on the constant blacklisting, and in some cases, simply bad mouthing of the Caribbean, this answer appears to be they do not. So what the tax systems should ultimately be are decisions that require empirical analysis, and is another day for debating altogether. However, the Caribbean should not underestimate the number of globally influential persons that grace our shores as visitors and residents. But our governments must provide the arguments and basis for these parties to lobby on our behalf. And that requires collaboration and singing from a consistent hymn sheet in the Caribbean. It does not preclude different views and structures, as even a choir has a bass, alto, sopranos, etc., but all working on one accord. Not all territories will provide all services, but similar to the greatest nations having their tax-free solutions, like Delaware in the US, Jersey in the United Kingdom, and so on, the Caribbean must work at devising tax systems that enable it to address the three questions above that are properly supported by empirical data and information, and will ultimately allow our charm and charisma to solicit the lobby efforts of those that love our region, but to date have not been prepared to fight on our behalf, as what was being fought has never been clear. Losing the facilitator of middle-class development is not an option. Financial services in the Caribbean will only survive where economic policies and the systems and processes support them, and they exist. That requires vision, planning, and collaboration. We know the developed countries would not meet with a single Caribbean country, but instead would meet with a group. They prefer meeting with the Caribbean as a group, as opposed to meeting with single small countries. We must therefore make every effort to utilize the presence of our group for the betterment of the affairs of CARIFORM. There is one major challenge that I want to bring to attention that has enormous implications to healthcare, and that is the nursing shortage and its implications for the health industry. The Caribbean is already along a despairing path in losing some of the brightest and best of our professionals to more developed countries. Our nurses trained in the region, I can speak in particular of the Bahamas, are being recruited heavily by health centers in the United States to our detriment. There is a major shortage of nurses in the United States. I recall that Vice President Joseph Biden, at a meeting with us, a CARIFORM meeting with us, told us that America will not apologize for taking the best and the brightest from our countries. And he indicated that his country was built on being able to attract the best and the brightest. This matter has become of acute urgency for our region, and a formula has to be found. The quality of healthcare is being threatened. Dr. Dwayne Sands, cardiovascular surgeon, member of parliament, and former minister of health, stated last week in his June budget debate that contact with a registered nurse is a critical component of good patient outcome. And he said, we in the Bahamas have lost up to 50% of our critical care nurses. Because of this, we cannot open the intensive care unit to full capacity. This is critical. These are issues to be considered at the highest level of CARICOM. And there's absolutely no doubt about that. We have a situation where the Bahamas recruits nurses from places in the Caribbean like Guyana, and they come here, and then they're recruited to go to the United States. And when we look at the enormous amount of money that they pay relative to what is earned here, then we know that we have a major problem and our healthcare is threatened and we must do something about it. I just simply want to say that we have to ensure that our environment is protected. I once recommended to the Vice Chancellor of the West Indies that the countries like the Bahamas, where there's dynamic development, spend an enormous amount of money on environmental impact assessments and environmental impact management plans. And why would not our universities like UWI have some kind of capacity or develop some kind of capacity to participate in that and become a treasury of information for the region that could go from generation to generation, century to century. And once he came back to me and said that a group of the professors had formed such a unit. I'm not quite sure where it is, but we in the region must ensure that we do our utmost to pass on to future generations of Caribbean people, right? An environment that we have appreciated, that we have become used to, and that they could, in fact, have the benefit of that. In our waters, for example, in the Bahamas, we have expanded enormously the amount of waters under protection. We have spent an enormous amount of money on the defense force. We have discussed bilaterally poaching, all with the view to protecting our waters towards ensuring that we can stave off being overfished. It is important that we do that. We must also recognize that astronauts have indicated from time to time that as they overfly the Bahamas in space, the waters of the Exumas are the most beautiful in the world, the emerald green waters. I say these things simply to say that we have to take advantage of our product. We have to improve our product, and we have to keep on looking at it to ensure that whether it's heritage tourism, whether it's cultural tourism, whether it's religious tourism, whatever it is, we have to ensure that we continue to work at it, because the fastest and most effective generator of revenue happens to be right now tourism. We must continue to work again for electricity. It becomes a very expensive enterprise in our region. It is most intimidating to investors, the cost of electricity, and we therefore must continue to work to ensure that we have alternatives and that we are able to not have our economy unduly negatively impacted by that. I really would expect, therefore, that CARICOM, recognizing that energy and the environment, tourism are all critical to our future, would ensure that the agencies that we have that are dedicated to dealing efficiently with the challenges of our region, that we review them with the view to seeing whether they are able, okay, to continue with what they're doing in the present form, or alternatively, whether there ought to be changes. I want to end with national security. We are all encumbered by the incredible spate of illegal importation of guns. We in the Bahamas have negotiated with the relevant American agencies with a view to being able to interdict, but we have this very, very pressing problem, a problem that we have discussed at the Caribbean level, at the CARICOM level, and these problems are shared by countries throughout the region. We have to go to the sources of these guns come from as a region, and we have to manifest strength in being able to find a way to minimize the extent to which our countries and our country's reputation is being influenced by the illegal importation of guns. Finally, I wanted to end with, again, my first impressions of the region many years ago. When I went to Grenada for the first time as a Minister of Health, Douglas Manley was the Minister of Health of Jamaica. And I remember leaving Grenada with a sense of the romance that the islands of the Caribbean offer. And this happened as well as in St. Lucia and St. Kitts, small island nations where I had the opportunity to see and to feel this. And I use the word romance because it's an attractive marketing tool. And that I remember dancing with the chief medical officer, an elderly lady, the chief medical officer of Jamaica. Her name was Catherine Mooney, recruited in Ghana by Douglas Manley. And I was dancing with the song Feeling. And I said to myself, we have special countries that offer special experiences to the point where we cannot fail to market them properly with a view to ensuring that we can maximize the impact of the revenue towards helping the least of our brethren. The philosophy of CARICOM was, we must form ourselves into a unit we must be able to form ourselves into a unit to do things for our people that they are unable to do for themselves. And so going into it, I remember Billy Miller was the Minister of Health at the time, and I call these names just to date the period, because it was so important for me to have the groundings, okay, of beautiful flora, beautiful fauna, waters, and I use the term romance. Grand Anne's Beach on a full moon night. And I described it on so many occasions. And I remember the former Minister of Jamaica, Tony Abrams, and myself at an international conference, really joining up in promoting the region in this special, special context. These things are important if we are going to be able to give our people the promise of a better life. And most certainly, we in the Bahamas are doing that. I want to be able to remind all of us that politicians are elected for 5 years, so to speak, with a constitutional term of 5 years. As they approach the end of their term, they are being driven by an election that they have to win. And these matters are secondary. More times than not, too many of us only bring CARICOM to the fore when we go to the meetings of CARICOM. And therefore, we ignore the review that is necessary on our part, ensuring we are able to make recommendations that can strengthen CARICOM, strengthen its capacity to help the people of our region. So please, for me, permit me to end my remarks by indicating that we must, as professionals, recognize that there are so many issues that we have to contend with in this new world order, where a pandemic knows no boundaries, no race, no color, and where it had an enormous impact on our lives. Let us work together to anticipate that there will be more of such experiences, and that we must be better prepared to deal with them more effectively. Let us not have a situation where we say, oh, the Cayman has done well, Barbados has done well, but the others are struggling. These are matters that the founders of CARICOM intended to avoid by being able to ensure that our strength will be maximized by the levels of unity we forge, by the common ground that we share, and by the common policies that we articulate and promulgate, all with the view, at the end of the day, of making it better for future generations of our people to know that those who came before did their best to create a Caribbean that they have the honor of inheriting. Thank you very much.